Good afternoon. I'm Krishauna Hines-Gaither. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I am the Associate Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at Guilford College. And my office is under the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. We will have two other panelists with us today, Gwen Erickson and also Sarah Thuesen. And we will have more formal introductions of them in just a moment. Gwen announced earlier, but I want to make sure that you all are aware, if you would turn off your cameras, because we have sign language interpreters and we don't want it to be too confusing for our interpreters or for those who need those services. And so if you would just mute your cameras and also your audio, and then once we're finished with our presentations, we will invite you to open your cameras, open your audio, and join us for a discussion at the end. And so let me share my screen with you. Okay. All right, so welcome to our event today, Say My Name, the Black Contributions of Quaker Abolitionism. This event is being sponsored by the Intercultural Engagement Center of the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Guilford College, as well as the History Department and Quaker Archives. I'm going to invite one of our students to help us today. Her name is Miriam Sharif, and she will help us with our introductions. Welcome, Miriam.
Hi, I'm Miriam. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you all for being here today. I am a Community and Justice Studies major with a Spanish Language Society minor and Peace and Conflict minor. I use she, her, her pronouns, and today I have the honor of introducing our guest speakers. So to first start off, I'd like to introduce Krishauna Hines-Gaither. She is the Associate Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and she also directs the Intercultural Engagement Center here at Guilford College. Her research interests are transnational feminism, African diaspora studies, and African influences in Latin American and Francophone countries. She has completed a forthcoming chapter on the complexities of Quaker abolition that will soon publish by Rotherledge Press. The book is edited by Wes Daniels of Guilford College. In addition to her scholarship, Krishauna stays busy running behind her 5-year-old son, Giovanni.
Thank you, Miriam. I will introduce Sarah Thuesen. Sarah Thuesen is an assistant professor of history at Guilford College, and she also teaches in the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies programs. In addition to publishing several articles on social justice struggles in the contemporary South, Sarah has published a book called Greater Than Equal: African American Struggles for Schools and Citizenship in North Carolina from 1919 to 1965 by the University of North Carolina Press. Before coming to Guilford College, Sarah worked at the University of North Carolina Southern Oral History Program, and she continues to look for new opportunities to engage students in public history work. Since 2018, Sarah has been serving on the North Carolina Historic Highway Marker Advisory Committee. Thank you.
And I'd also like to introduce Gwen Gosney Erickson. She is a Quaker librarian and college archivist here at Guilford College. Gwen has served in her current but ever-evolving position here at Guilford College since 2000. Her own scholarly research interest focuses on the intersections of Quaker studies, African American history, gender studies, and U.S. social justice movements, especially those with local connections that are still present with us today. She has a passion for sharing resources and connecting people to history through access to primary sources that deepen our understanding of the human experience. Welcome, Krishauna, Sarah, and Gwen.
Thank you, Miriam. So I will be our first presenter today, and I will kind of give a backstory about our Quaker history and as that relates to Guilford College. And then Gwen will, Sarah will follow me. And so first, I just wanted to start with the public naming conventions at Guilford College. And Mariam, give me a thumbs up if you can see this slide. Okay, great. And so we do have some public recognition of abolitionist work at Guilford College. And so we have a historical marker to Levi Coffin, oftentimes termed the president or the father of the Underground Railroad. And so we do have that public acknowledgement of Levi Coffin. We also have a road, Levi Coffin Drive, that is named after Levi Coffin on our campus. We also honor the founder of Quaker Faith, George Fox, and we have George Fox Road, Nathan Hunt Road. And so we certainly do have some public naming and recognitions of Quakers within that are related to what is now Greensboro, then New Garden. And so what we want to do today is kind of look, in addition to those who have been honored, and to see and to complicate that legacy a little bit more, and also to look in terms of who may have been left out. And so with that, I want to kind of give a background on Levi Coffin for those who may not be as familiar. I'm sure that a lot of you are. But Levi Coffin is credited with helping to liberate over 3,000 enslaved Africans. He also was a dealer in free labor cotton goods and groceries, so he refused to market goods or distribute goods that were made or produced by enslaved labor. He also worked in collaboration with Black abolitionists, which we'll talk about. That's going to be the main points that I'll be making today. He also refused to lodge, and you have to look at the time frame in the 19th century in which he was living. He refused to lodge in places that had separate accommodations for African Americans, which was not an easy feat because there were few places that allowed integrated living quarters. But if he was traveling with an African American, he would oftentimes give up his good accommodations to those who had less favorable conditions. He also would sometimes, as a youngster, he would help slave catchers and say, I will help you to find your enslaved property. However, he would serve as a diversion and say, I think we should go west, when he knew that they probably went east, for example. He worked cross-denominationally with many different denominations for the cause of anti-slavery, and he petitioned the U.S. government to provide homes and rations for newly freed African Americans, and he got it. The government granted those homestays and rations to those newly freed African Americans. And so I say this to say, I don't have an issue with the spaces being named in Levi Coffin's honor. I think he certainly merits that. At the same time, I think we have failed in terms of, and this is across the nation, I think we have failed in terms of complicating the legacy of our founders, and also making sure that it's a complete story in terms of whose stories are told and whose stories have been left out. And so in terms of stories being left out, John Woolman is a very well-known Quaker abolitionist who did amazing work. Stephen J. White says that Woolman most influenced anti-slavery forces in North Carolina. So I won't focus much on Woolman because he's pretty well known amongst Quaker abolitionists. However, Benjamin Lay is not as well known. And this is one of those voices that I think merits a lot more attention. And so Benjamin Lay, he was also a dwarf. And so he physically, he had a presence that caused people to reject him. Not only that, but his message. And so he called out Quakers and did a lot of unconventional practices to get their attention. For example, he would steal Quaker children. He would give them back, but he would steal Quaker children so that parents could understand what might it feel like for an enslaved African to lose their children if they're sold away from them. So he used a lot of radical techniques, and he ended up being disowned by the Quaker meetings for these practices, and in particular for a publication that he published where he really did call Quakers to task in terms of their silence and complicity in slavery. And Levi Coffin, I want to bring him back into the discussion in terms of public naming. Although we have historical markers after Levi Coffin, and we also have a road that is named after him, it's very interesting that Levi Coffin himself said, I never wanted this. He said in his book Reminiscences, he wrote, what I had done, I believe, was simply a Christian duty, and not for the purpose of being seen of men, or for notoriety, which I have never sought. So it's so intriguing to me that although we have a lot of public history to Levi Coffin, which I believe he merits, he himself is saying, I never wanted this. So just an interesting dichotomy. And so how do we reframe our abolitionist story? And so Adrienne Israel, a scholar who worked at Guilford for over 30 years, she wrote in a recent publication, she wrote, "The free Black community," let me minimize so I can see the quote here. Okay. She wrote, the free Blacks in Piedmont, North Carolina who supported the Underground Railroad warrant closer study, not only in the context of slavery, but also to better understand the Black pursuit of freedom. And then another historian, David Siselsky, writes, fugitive slaves received their most important backing from other slaves. This is the story that needs to be told, that is often omitted from our history. And so why did Levi Coffin have to enter into so many collaborations with African-American liberators? And so Levi Coffin writes in his same book, Reminiscences, many Friends or Quakers were led to believe that there was some disgrace about abolitionism, and they fell in with the current opposition. And so all through this book, he talks about the opposition that he faced from Quakers, from trying to get Quakers to understand and to accept an anti-slavery platform. And he became very, very frustrated with Quakers and Friends. And so he writes about this quite a bit. Next, we have another scholar, historian, Yanessa says, in Indiana, when Coffin leaves New Garden in 1827 and leaves New Garden, which is now Greensboro, and goes to Indiana, Coffin made contact with the local free Black community and made them aware of his willingness to hide runaways, because most of the runaways were hiding, lying in wait within the African-American community. So Levi Coffin couldn't even really get into that community without working in concert with African-American abolitionists. Their story is one that is rarely told. And so one of the individuals with whom Levi Coffin worked was George de Baptiste. George de Baptiste was a shop owner. He owned a barber shop, and he would ferry African-American freedom seekers from Kentucky to Ohio and Kentucky to Indiana. And I've had the honor of going to both of those bridges. They looked nothing like this at the time, of course, but to see where that operation was taking place. Keep that name in mind, George de Baptiste, because it will come up again. When I first started doing this research, I also thought that Levi Coffin and other Quaker scholars and historians never named African Americans. I must say that that is actually not the case. When I read a lot of the literature from Levi Coffin in particular, but other Quaker scholars and historians, they actually named African American abolitionists who helped them. And so you can see from your screen here, these are just some of the names, but they are named. But it's the people who followed them who systematically erase these names from history. But I must say, Levi Coffin named African Americans with whom he worked. And so a few of those that I mentioned, General Hamilton's Saul. Levi Coffin would work with General Hamilton's Saul, and the only thing that we have is the name Saul or perhaps Solomon, and Dr. Codwell's Tom. And these were enslaved Africans who lived locally in the New Garden area, now the Greensboro area. And Levi Coffin and his abolitionist family would work with Saul and Tom to help them to locate enslaved Africans who had been stolen. And so those who perhaps were born free, but they were stolen. Those who perhaps had been granted their freedom later in life, but they were re-enslaved because they were caught without a pass or without freedmen's papers, or they were taken across lines illegally. He would incorporate the voices of Saul and Tom because he couldn't get into that enslaved community himself without, of course, being seen. And so he would use other enslaved to help him to locate these stolen individuals, and then they would launch cases and litigate their cases to help them to gain their freedom. So they are named, but oftentimes those names are not recognized in our public history. Edie is someone else that comes up in the literature. She was enslaved by Dr. Codwell, and she learned that she was about to be sold away. She ran in the cold months. I believe it was winter because she ended up being frostbitten. She ran, hid out in the woods for about 2 weeks. She later ended up in the Coffin home. Coffin's mother ends up nursing her and the baby back to health. They really think that the baby is not going to make it, but they nurse the baby back to health. The woman is absolutely terrified to go back to the Caldwell plantation because she fears that she will be separated from her children. She has other children other than the baby with whom she runs. Levi Coffin, who was a young teenager at the time, begged his father to allow him to go to Dr. Caldwell and to plead the case for them not to sell Edie. He was successful in that plea, and Dr. Caldwell did not sell Edie. But this was some of his first abolitionist work. I want you to remember the name Dr. Caldwell because it will come up again. And so here we go. Dr. Caldwell, and I'm just troubling how we present public history. So this is from NCpedia. And I was just curious of how he would be presented. And so Dr. Caldwell, the slave owner that I just mentioned, on NCpedia, it says he was a Presbyterian minister, educator, physician, statesman. And it never mentions anything about his being a slave owner. And then the last sentence that's on NCpedia, it says eventually amounting to his estate amounted to 550 acres, on which he ran a successful plantation type business. Again, I think the language is so interesting. He had several enslaved Africans working on that plantation, but it's almost deduced to it's something like a plantation, but definitely slavery is not mentioned. I looked in the Greensboro News and Record, and there was an article in honor of David Caldwell. It never mentioned that he was a slave owner. There is an academy in Greensboro that bears the name Caldwell. Their website never mentioned that he was an enslaver. And so I just find this really interesting, the way that public history frames these founding fathers, if you will, of what is now Greensboro. Duncan Cameron is another enslaver, one of the largest enslavers in the North Carolina area. And today it's a historical site, the plantation, which is the Stagville Plantation. On that plantation, there was a woman named Mary Walker. She took her freedom in 1848. Mary Walker, Duncan Cameron had a very sick daughter. And so he took that daughter to Philadelphia for medical treatment. When she was in Philadelphia, the law was, even if you are an enslaved person, even if a master brings you to a free state, legally, you can take your freedom. She didn't know that. However, when Mary Walker was in a hotel with her owners, they knew this law, but felt that she was so loyal to them that she would never run. A gentleman named William Johnson, a free Black man working in Philadelphia, came to her and said to her, "You may not know this, but in Philadelphia, if you make it to a free state, you are free." This is abolitionist work. And when we frame abolitionism in the United States, oftentimes that is a white framing. But William Johnson risked quite a bit to make sure that she had this information. And Mary Walker took her freedom and lived as a fugitive for decades. For her entire life after escaping from Raleigh, she lived as a fugitive. Why do I bring this up? We're in the midst of a presidential debate right now. And I think it's really important that we bring out all forms of our history in framing. So I've already mentioned Levi Coffin. He worked very closely with George de Baptiste, who was an African-American abolitionist. George de Baptiste worked for President William Henry Harrison. And reports even say that he was there on his deathbed and also was a driver for William Henry Harrison. We know William Henry Harrison. We know the history of the president. We do not know the abolitionists that are attached to that history. At the same time, I just mentioned Mary Walker, who took her freedom from Raleigh, North Carolina. She ends up in the Boston, Cambridge area. She works for over a decade with a woman named Anne Jean Robbins Lyman. Anne Jean Robbins Lyman was the mother of Catherine Robbins Delano. who was the mother of Sarah Ann Delano, who was the mother of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Again, we know about President Roosevelt, but I suspect you may never have had a President Roosevelt were it not for the care of Mary Walker, who nursed his great-great-great-grandmother for over a decade. So I will stop here and turn it over to Sarah.
Thank you, Krishauna. I'm going to share my screen here, so just a momentary pause. Okay, can someone give me a thumbs up if they can see everything? All right. Well, thanks again to Krishauna and Gwen for kind of including me in this USS work, because their involvement in it predates my own. I've been kind of building on their foundations and trying at Guilford to involve students in it. And so I want today to share with you, what we know about who Lavina, or Vina as she's referred to in some documents, who Vina Curry was, and some thoughts about how we're currently working to try to remember her and mark her on campus, and how we might look for other opportunities to do that in the future. So let me go ahead and I wanted to first acknowledge the scholarship foundations I'm standing on here. I'm a 20th century historian, and so I'm a little bit out of my field in looking into this 19th century story. And my recently retired colleague, Adrienne Israel's work has been essential. I've had multiple classes read the article I have cited here, which is our best secondary source on the Currys. And so that's been of great helpfulness. I also would like to mention the work of Fergus Bordewich, who came to Guilford not that long ago and shared insights from his book, Bound for Canaan. And also the book here by Warren Miltier is hot off the presses just this year, but is also going to be really helpful for this work, as well as the People Not Property project at UNCG that is going on to digitize slave deeds. So all of that work has been really helpful with this project. So I'll share with you kind of, what we know about Vina Curry and her husband, Archibald Curry, from kind of the official record. Few white women and even fewer Black women make much of an appearance in official government documents of the antebellum period. Enslaved people were typically only counted in number, not name. White people, as well as free Black people like the Currys, had more chance of being named in census records. But before 1850, it was only the head of the household who was named. And so in the case of married couples, the head of household was always considered to be the husband. And so it's Lavina's husband, Archibald, who clearly shows up in the census data. And what we're able to gather from that is he was a free Black man. The census data indicates that he lived in Moore and Robeson counties, there in the southern part of the state, before coming to Guilford County sometime between 1810 and 1820. He purchased 2 parcels of land in Guilford County along Brush Creek and Horsepen Creek, totaling almost 13 acres in 1820, 1821. We know that from property deed records. He sold that land in 1826, and his household included a wife and 7 children by 1830, but those other household members are not named in the census record. We also can gather that he died sometime in the early 1830s. We don't know exactly when. So the official record is even less forthcoming with regard to Lavina or Vina, and I'll mention in a moment why we have kind of two sources of what her preferred name was. We have been able to determine that she was his widow, and most likely the mother of his 7 children, although we don't have a date for their marriage or dates of their children's births. So it's possible that he had been married previously and some of his children were from a previous wife, but we're assuming that most likely his children all were hers as well, 5 of whom were born after 1820. Here's where she is tied to Guilford College. She first appears in the very early ledger books of New Garden Boarding School, the precursor to Guilford College, in 1837, 1838, where she apparently worked as a washerwoman. And I know it's probably hard to read on the screen there, but I have an image of a sample from those ledger books. You can see at the top there the name Lavina written in Curry and notations about debts and credits. We've been able to gather, and Gwen Erickson really has helped me puzzle through these sources, that she was renting a house somewhere on campus and also paying money for certain supplies like firewood. And so those ledger books indicate those records. The 1840 census also makes reference to 3 unnamed female free colored persons at New Garden Boarding School, one of whom was most likely Vina Curry. The last appearance she makes in the ledger books is 1843. So if all we had was, kind of the official, government or financial records, we'd have a name, but not much of a story behind it. The real story we have of her life comes from a personal memoir written by Addison Coffin, who was the son of Alethea Coffin and Vestal Coffin, both very involved in the Underground Railroad. And Vestal Coffin was a cousin to Levi Coffin. And in 1897, he posthumously published a memoir. And there's one paragraph in there that refers to Vina or Vina. And it's only one paragraph, but it's a powerful one, and I think it's worth reading out loud. It says, "There was a free Negro named Arch Curry living near our home who died a few years after father. His widow's name was Vina. She was the washerwoman for the boarding school for several years. She was shrewd and discerning and would suffer her husband's free papers to be stolen. This was done 15 times to my knowledge. When an intelligent fugitive presented himself who would fill Arch Curry's standard, and there were 1 or more families of trusty immigrants going west, the free papers were stolen, and the fugitive sent through as a free man to Levi Coffin, who by then was in Indiana. Levi Coffin returned the papers in safety. This was done occasionally with other papers, but none were ever used like those of Arch Curry." So a couple things really stand out for me here. We learned that this process of aiding fugitive enslaved people, passing on the free papers to someone else that they could use for documentation. This happened more than once. It was done by folks other than Vina Curry, but locally at least, she was known as having done this the most. We also get, the only real glimpses we have of her personality here. The fact that he mentions that she was shrewd and discerning, which I think suggests she played a role in determining which fugitive enslaved people were trustworthy enough to safeguard her late husband's free papers and use them wisely. So that those sources are, the best kind of official sources we have, which, we're continuing to do more research. We wish we had more ready sources, but we're going to continue doing additional genealogical research and archival research. But there are a lot of unanswered questions at this point. I include here a picture of the Underground Railroad tree in the Guilford woods, because I know when I've gone there before, or taken students there, I always think about the stories we do know about the Underground Railroad, but also try to imagine all the ones that we probably don't know and may never know. And there are lots of unknowns here that we've been thinking about, and I want to share a couple with you. So first of all, why did Vina Curry assume the risks of Underground Railroad involvement, and what did that involvement mean to her? The imperatives of abolition and Black freedom may seem to suggest a self-evident answer to this question, but I think it's worth emphasizing Curry's agency in choosing to take on freedom work that put her at great risk. In the 1830s in Guilford County, free Blacks were about 2 to 3% of the total population, and depending on the year, about 15 to 25% of the Black population. It was not a given that that minority within a minority would actively aid the enslaved population. Both Adrienne Israel and Fergus Bordewich share stories of free African Americans who exposed fugitive enslaved people escaping. And while certainly the overwhelming threat to fugitives came from whites and not fellow African Americans, these stories nonetheless emphasize that Vina Curry could have chosen to prioritize self-protection over the liberation of others. What makes her choice even more significant is that she made those choices in the mid-1830s, a moment of increasing white surveillance. It was already a crime to aid fugitive slaves, a crime that was more harshly punished in the wake of Nat Turner's uprising in 1831 in Virginia. White lawmakers in North Carolina also passed new restrictions governing enslaved people and free African Americans at that time. Laws were passed making it a crime to teach enslaved people to read, prohibiting free Blacks from voting, attending school, or preaching in public gatherings. In compounding the vulnerability of race, Curry experienced the vulnerabilities of gender and widowed motherhood. And so did she suffer the stealing of Arch's papers as a widow's mandate of sorts to honor her late husband? Had Arch Curry been involved in Underground Railroad work, or was this something that Vina took on herself out of her own commitment to helping those even more vulnerable than she? Did she do it on her own terms? How often were the coffins in the Currys of one accord? Or to put it differently, how unified were local abolitionists across the color line? And these are all questions I think we'll continue to explore. A second question I pose here, what was her experience of New Garden boarding school? You know, we have that mention in the 1840 census of at least 2 other free women of color working at the school, but we know very little about them. You know, how included were those women in the life of the school? They held the status of being free, but were their labors recognized and valued? The great historian Carter Woodson, often regarded as the founder of African American history, wrote in 1930 about what he saw as the critical role of African American washerwomen. He noted that so often they provided wages, you know, for their families when few opportunities existed for African Americans. But he says they played another role too. And I just want to read to you a short passage from what he wrote. He said, this same washerwoman was no less significant in the life of the community. The uplift worker sought her at home to interest her in neglected humanity. The abolitionist found her a ready listener to the story of her oppressed brethren in chains. The colonizationist stopped to have her persuade the family to try life anew in Liberia, and the preacher paid his usual calls to connect her more vitally with the effort to relieve the church of pecuniary embarrassment. While burdened with the responsibility of maintaining a family, she was not too busy to listen to these messages and did not consider herself too poor to contribute to the relief of those who, with a tale of woe, convinced her that they were less favorably circumstanced than she. So Woodson portrays African-American washerwomen as, a model of selflessness. And I can imagine Vina Curry fitting this model, which makes me all the more curious to find out what became of her. And we don't know. She kind of trails off in the historic record in the mid-1840s. Adrienne Israels tried to do some genealogical research into her children and has uncovered some really interesting potential details about two daughters, one by the name of Sarah or Sally Curry, who may have been married to someone named Richard Ladd, one by the name of Fanny or Rachel Curry, who may have been married to Ellis Mitchell, a free Black man in Guilford County who worked as a blacksmith. Both Ladd and Mitchell were involved in abolitionist work, and hopefully we can maybe find out more about those stories and some of her other children. We also are interested in, using her as a starting point for figuring out what other names and stories among individuals, African-American individuals in particular, who contributed to the life of the early college, have been lost to our collective institutional memory. Gwen is going to talk more about that story, and so I want to conclude with some thoughts about three ways that students and faculty and staff involved with this project are already beginning to document and honor Vina Curry's legacy, and also some thoughts about where we might go from here beyond that. So rather than using all the unknowns about Vina Curry as, viewing that as a roadblock, in one sense I might suggest that we use that as an invitation to do some creative work around her story. And I'm kind of inspired here. The last time I taught African-American history, we read Colson Whitehead's Underground Railroad, and of course he was supposed to come to Guilford when the pandemic struck. That was rescheduled for this coming spring. So hopefully that will happen, because I think he's a model of how you can use your historical imagination to fill in some of the gaps and still tell important truths. And using him as an inspiration, I have had the students in my current History 103 class recently. We read the sources that we had on Vina Curry, and then I invited them to do some creative work around her story. Help us imagine, how you're picturing her, or write a short story filling in the gaps, or write a poem. And I then had students share what they had done and vote on which pieces of creative work spoke to them the most. And the students in that class, the most votes went to a first-year student by the name of A.J. Jackson. And she is here, and I invited her just to say a few words, her project statement about why she chose to represent Vina Curry the way she did. The image she drew is here on the right. I've also included two statements there about how she described Vina Curry, saying she remembered everything that was forgotten, and Vina Curry's open heart and drive to help others is a story that makes Guilford what it is. So if AJ can unmute her sound and her video, I will let her say a few words.
Within the project, I hope to highlight Vina Curry's courage, wit, and rebelliousness. I started off my drawing making sure to define her nose and her hair. In my opinion, I felt as if Vina Curry's facial features reflected those of a Nubian queen, so I drew as such. I then decided to incorporate colors that reflected African roots, such as the red, green, and black that's in the African flag. I perfected every loose curl to the coils that lie in her kitchen, waiting to be combed. Since this was a time where women were seen as less superior to men, I tried to incorporate as many feminine colors as I could possibly do. That's why I put it in the chain and in the earrings. Vina Curry's afro was my way of showing her fierceness, the afro being a symbol for many things, especially how it was used during the late 60s with groups such as Black Panther. If you look closely, you see that within my drawing, Vina Curry has no eyes. This is due to the fact that I wanted her to convey a sense of dislike towards the world she knew probably all her life and never being able to see what the future was able to hold.
Thanks so much, AJ. Another way in which we're trying to mark and honor her legacy is by the creation of a historic marker. And this past spring, I taught an Introduction to Public History course, and I invited the students to, think like a public historian and how they would go about creating a historic marker for Vina Curry. As Krishauna mentioned, I currently am serving on the state committee that reviews historic highway markers. And I had the coordinator of that program, Ansley Wegner, speak to my class about what getting a highway marker entails. It entails a lot of research, a lot of documentation, and even more challenging in some ways, once you compile all that research, you have to boil down that story to a very small number of words. On the top left there, the Levi Coffin marker on our campus is a state marker, and you can see it's large type and so very few words. That marker was added in 1955. There were very few markers that gave any indication of African American history in the state at that time. And that's no exception. From that marker, of course, you would assume that the work of abolition was really kind of a white effort exclusively. So I had students come up with drafts for the text of a marker, both if they were, hypothetically creating a state marker, but also I asked them, what about if we did a small type marker, like the one indicated there below, the Underground Railroad marker that was added, that was the work of some Guilford faculty in the year 2000. And you can fit a few more words on those types of marker. They don't have to go through the same state process. The state marker program also right now is currently suspended due to budget cuts and hopefully will resume relatively soon. But that was another reason that we've pursued the small type marker. And I'll just read to you the text that this class collectively came up with. It's a draft text. I'm going to be working with an advisory committee this spring and into the following academic year to refine this and figure out where we'll put the marker exactly, how it will be designed. But this is kind of the start, and it reads, Lavina Vina Curry, free Black abolitionist, widowed mother, worked as a washerwoman at New Garden boarding school beginning in late 1830s. Lent late husband's free papers to at least 15 men escaping slavery, worked with Quaker abolitionists, including the Coffin family, represents essential roles African Americans played in both the Underground Railroad and in the life of Guilford College since its earliest days. I'm going to continue with my presentation right now just so we stay on schedule, but I do welcome thoughts about this text. I will be inviting as much participation as possible as we move closer to finalizing this marker. Please get in touch with me. I'm just going to conclude by bringing it kind of up to the present, which is a good segue for Gwen. I hope we'll use Curry's story and USS work in general as a touchstone for just deeper engagement in general with our institutional history, including its more recent past. That's important for an honest reckoning with the ways in which our institution has both resisted and reinforced systems of oppression. And I think it's an important way of illustrating to students within their immediate surroundings the connections between past and present. and in cultivating a sense of institutional investment. I've spotlighted two recent alums here, both history majors. Cliff Whitfield on the right started digging into college history during a North Carolina history course that Gwen and I co-taught. He helped prepare an exhibit on the year 1968 at Guilford. And then that sparked his interest in public history work. He went on to do an internship at the Charlotte Hawkins Brown site. He worked on the Curry marker in that public history class. He is now a graduate student in the public history program at UNCG. He could not be here today because he's in class, which I approve of. But I wanted to just give him a shout out because he's agreed to serve on this advisory committee for the Curry marker, which I'm really excited about. And Reva Krieger was also a history major at Guilford College. She wrote a senior thesis looking at the civil rights movement in Greensboro. She is now working in Atlanta with the Quaker Voluntary Service, doing environmental justice work. And I'm going to let her have the last word. She has to run off to a meeting, but she is here, I hope, and can want to just say a few words about what USS work meant to her. So Reva, I will let you close this part of the presentation out.
Cool. Can you hear me? My computer's kind of weird.
Yes, I can.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Yeah.
And thanks everyone for having me here. Sarah just asked me to talk a little bit about, I'm Reva Krieger. My pronouns are she, her. I graduated from Guilford in May, and Sarah just asked me to talk a little bit about why the University Studying Slavery project and this work around just this historical representation of Vina Curry was important to me as a student. And I think, I became involved with the University Studying Slavery project my senior year at Guilford, and it has really impacted the way that I think about Guilford and its history. I know that when I came to Guilford as a student, some of the very first orientation programs that I went to were about Guilford's pride and its abolitionist history. We would go on, I remember going on tours to the Underground Railroad tree and learning about Levi Coffin and the work that the white Quakers that shaped Guilford did to help enslaved Black people find freedom through the Underground Railroad. And I think as I got more involved in Greensboro's community and the ways that I engaged with history, I began to see that really the stories that institutions and communities cherish so much often need to be interrogated and complicated. And I think that particularly when those stories involve narratives of race and power and well-meaning white people, those are some of the stories that we need to question the most. And so fortunately, Krishauna, Gwen, and Sarah were already doing this really amazing work with the University Studying Slavery project. And I was able to jump in kind of in my last year. And I think, just to reiterate what a lot of people have said, the most meaningful part of my involvement with this project has been around the Vina Curry marker and just learning and really illuminating the way that Black people in Guilford's community took so much strength and courage and agency in creating and constructing their own freedom, and really recentering that narrative away from the white Quaker abolitionists who aided in that effort, but really, uplifting the work that the Black community at Guilford did to free themselves. And I think that that's really evident in Vina Curry's story of sharing her late husband's free papers, as we've heard. And I think just the last thing that I want to say is, as a student or a former student, this historical work matters to me because the Guilford that exists today, that I called home for 4 years, is inseparable from its past. And over the course of those 4 years that I was at Guilford, it really became clear to me that Guilford still has a lot of work to do as a predominantly and historically white institution in creating a community that really values and respects all the people in its community, particularly students, faculty, and staff of color. And I know that Guilford can only hope to create real transformative change through acknowledging and reckoning with the ways that it has and continues to perpetuate white supremacy. And it has been really rewarding to do this work, and I'm really grateful for for everyone here. Yeah, and so thanks for having me.
Thank you, Riva. And I'll turn it over to Gwen Erickson now.
Thank you, Sarah. This is Gwen Erickson. I'm going to share my screen here. And hopefully everyone can see my screen. I did a presentation last week where that went a little odd, so let me know if there's any problems viewing. So as we mentioned, a lot of the conversation so far has focused on Vina Curry, who we've already talked about. But I'd like to really bring things forward a bit and acknowledge continuing legacies with focusing on Guilford College after the last references we have to her in the early 1840s. This image you see here is what New Garden Boarding School, it's our earliest image of New Garden Boarding School, would have looked like in the 1850s and 1860s. The majority of our pictures are showing up as very much centering white Quakers. In this particular image, you can see them in their 19th century, more simple dress. And you'll see that in some of the other pictures that I show today. But what the premise of today's presentation is to really highlight and center those that have been invisible on our campus. So one person I'd like to hold up, Sarah mentioned Vina Curry, and there's also the two unnamed additional women who show up on the 1840 census, so additional research is needed for that. We know there are probably other individuals throughout the 1850s and 1860s who is very hard to locate, so continuing to see if there's any passing references to names in ledger books of people who were employed at the college doing labor work as with carpenters, laundresses, and so forth. We do know a gentleman named Thomas Gossett was employed at Friends School, New Garden, and this is a quote here that is from the Quaker records of the North Carolina Yearly Meeting for Sufferings, collection of papers that focuses most directly on North Carolina Quaker work with assisting African Americans. It says here, Thomas Gossett, employed at the Friends Boarding School, has purchased his wife's freedom and has recently had his oldest son taken from him and sold for $650. So Thomas Gossett is collaborating with some of Quakers he knows through New Garden Boarding School. They're looking to find ways to raise sufficient funds in order to enable his son's freedom. Thomas Gossett's also very interesting to look at in terms of he also is an abolitionist, offering another form of that type of work, of not necessarily escaping northward at this point, but remaining in the South to continue trying to keep connection with his family and using his own earnings to purchase his wife's freedom and acquire freedom for his children. This is a picture I use often in presentations. It's from the transition as New Garden Boarding School was evolving into Guilford College, and is often portrayed as a photograph of the entire community. However, you will note it does include all of the students and faculty members and administrators of the college, but does not include any of the facilities, housekeeping, dining services type of staff who would have also been present, keeping the college going during this time period. So what I'd like to do next is go through images of people who would have been in this picture had it included everyone. And just wanted to also point out that this presentation is just a teaser for you. We'll be continuing this work, and each of these slides I show could be a whole 5 minutes or more unto themselves. Anne Brown, head cook the 1880s to approximately 1910. I'd like to point out this particular image of Anne Brown was taken on the grounds of the home of Louis Linden and Mary Mendenhall Hobbs. We have some photographs of that family also in the same setting. Hattie Pitts, made and also noted as nursing students when they were ill in the 1880s. John Pitts, hired in the 1880s during the construction of Archdale Hall. He was the college's hack driver, conveying students from the train station to campus, and later a janitor when automobiles made his previous carriage work obsolete. And he was also husband to Hattie Pitts. The Pitts also represent something that I see repeatedly in the records, as you'll have a couple that where both of them have ties of employment at the college, though often the husband will have a longer period of service, as at some point the wife steps back to focus more on child rearing and not working outside of the home as much. Ruth Watkins, domestic staff in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And this particular image, you see Anne Brown again in her work attire, and Ruth Watkins is on the right. Like the Pitts, the Watkins also have double connection, and Ruth Watkins seems to have worked longer at the college. Her husband, Henry Watkins, also is documented as doing carpentry work at the college in the 1880s. Uncle Munn. This particular picture, we do not have a full name for this gentleman. This image I actually just acquired about a month ago with a donation of a scrapbook from the settling of the estate of a former student. And the writing here says, Uncle Munn certainly has the record for sticking to things. He has been, or should I say, he has held a position at Guilford for 25 years. It's notable the term position is in quotes. We do not know what the intention of the student compiling the scrapbook was in including this, in quotation marks, and we don't know details about what Uncle Munn did at the college, though he is referenced sometimes in Guilfordians as well, just passing references to him at places. So we're, Judy Orchard was volunteering for us the past couple years as a graduate of Guilford, tracing any slight references to staff at Guilford through those early campus newspapers and yearbooks. This 1920, all three of these images are from 1928, showing staff at work in the college. The images on the left and the right are from the 1928 yearbook, and the image in the center is from a college promotional booklet advertising the fact that to showcase that the college had a modern laundry and press room, and also a central heating plant. So had central heating and all kinds of modern amenities as a place for sending your children for a solid education. But it's one of our few images actually showing multiple staff members. You'll notice on some of the larger versions of this, the laundry room was not exclusively African American, but predominantly was hiring women of color in those roles. Wesley Raleigh is the man who has credit with probably one of the longest terms of service maintaining that central heating unit at the college. He worked at Guilford for over 25 years. He also in the local community served as a firefighter. A 1930s student recalls it was Wes who arrived and fired the boiler so we could arise in comparative warmth. So there are references as well of students who worked, had work-study type of positions. We're trying to, so white students who would serve as assistants to Wesley Raleigh. And they talked about how hard the work was. They would have to take the coal, pick it up from, when it was delivered, and then shovel it from one pile to another and getting it into the boiler room. So very heavy labor of making sure that sufficient coal coal was always resupplied into the furnaces so that heating was maintained throughout the winter. David Caldwell served as a lead cook, and he joined the college 1913 to 1918, left to actually join the military during the First World War, and lived out of state for a while working in other positions, and then came back to Guilford County to serve as a cook 1930s through the 1950s. He does show up in campus newspapers and student memoirs, often referred to as King David, and praised for his cooking and keeping everyone filled up and well fed. Nelson Fitzgerald, who was a laundry worker in the within the 20th century. Henry Hill, Ellis Penn, and Marion Sapp. Here's a group picture of these men who were working with facilities, maintenance and groundskeeping type of work at the college in the 20th century. And another picture of Marion Sapp and also Hamp Alston as early facility staff. And then I'd like to bring to a close with Mary Ellen Cathy, who was the cook for Hobbs Hall. For those that don't know, Hobbs Hall is a women's dormitory that opened as a cooperative dorm. It had its own kitchen and dining facilities within the dorm. And so they had a staff member who served as kind of their kitchen coordinator to handle and supervise students with, chopping the potatoes and whatever needed to be done to feed everyone in the dorm. And Mary Ellen Cathy took on that role in 1951 and was there until the early 70s. So she actually bridges, as do some of the previous people I've mentioned that worked through the earlier part of the 20th century and then into the post-1962 dates. And you might wonder why I picked 1962 for the framing of this. And 1962 is when our first African and African American students arrived. So oftentimes the landscape of acknowledging Black presence on campus begins with that 1962 student arrival. And so when those students arrived, they often found support among those undernamed and often invisible African-American staff members who were already here. I also wanted to pull from this quote here that appeared in a 1995 Greensboro News and Record article. The number of Hobbs residents very much found, Mary Ellen Cathy was beloved, kind of kept them going through their college years, and undertook a major fundraising to endow a music scholarship that's still here at the college today to support students studying music major at Guilford, and named the scholarship in her memory and honor. Mary Ellen Cathy also has a nameplate on one of the rooms in Hobbs Hall. And it's leaped out to me in the article, Ms. Cathy says, "You don't know everything about me." And they didn't. And you'll notice here it also mentions that her students that she was seeing in the dorms probably did not realize in those early 1960s that she was also attending local civil rights activities and marches, something that many of our students purported to be neutral on or were not as actively involved with, and not as connected at that time. So much like the early boarding school years of the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s period, when some of our greatest abolitionists on campus were the underdocumented African-American staff, you still see some of those same themes coming up through the 1950s and early 1960s with our the staff members that were continuing to keep the college running. I'd like to close and just recognize I did not begin to name all of the names, and this screen here does show the names of a number of other early Black employees that we have begun to document. I'd like to mention, especially that we're uncovering names of folks early on in the 1870s and 1880s before we became a college, and then a growing number of people as we move into the 20th century. I'd also like to acknowledge the legacies and descendants. I could not do this work only using what we already have here in the archives. We pull on other sources to give us clues of where to look in the college's official record. Special thanks to Ruby Sapp-Leach, who provided several of the images that I included in today's presentation. I'd also like to thank all those who have shared past stories. And I'd like to acknowledge and express appreciation to Gertrude Jeb Upperman, class of '69, who I think is here on the call with us today, for fulfilling her grandfather's dream when Guilford finally opened the door. The staff members that I named all were working at Guilford at a time when they and their own children were prohibited from enrolling in classes at the college. Which is why I chose that 1962 date. And these early staff often served as a community to provide some continuity and support to help early African-American students navigate the integration of Guilford College. I'd also like to say that very much on my heart and mind as I pulled this together were Logie Meacham, Mary Minor, and many other members of the Woodyside and Collins Grove communities who are no longer physically with us, but inspired me in this work. As Sarah mentioned, this is just a beginning. Lots of opportunities to get involved. With each story that we uncover, we get more questions. So please do contact us, uss@guilford.edu, reach out to any of us individually and connect. Suggestions for interviewing elders in our community, conducting additional online research, researching, documenting through genealogical work to more firmly establish some of these interconnections and relationships within Guilford's history. So we'd like to close. Krishauna and I have a tradition of closing with queries for consideration to help us kind of reflect on what we've learned and continue the process of interrogating our history. So I'd like to ask Sarah to start us off and read the first, and then I'll read the second, and Krishauna will read the third. And then I'll just pause for a moment of just silent reflection for us. And then Krishauna will open things up for a brief period of Q&A once we have that moment of silence. Sarah.
What other names and stories have been lost to our collective institutional memory? What stories and narratives do we tell ourselves and others about our past? Are we aware of the privileges that exist for some and not others?
How do we negotiate Quaker heritage as both a space with long aspirational values associated with social justice and an institution entangled in a culture of white supremacy?
Is history something that I look to as a legacy to preserve a status quo or to protect a specific identity? How does my understanding of history inform my worldview and actions today? Thank you. If you all would like to turn on your cameras, you are welcome to do so. If not, that's fine too. We have about 5 minutes remaining. We do see a woman who deserves just a lot of credit. Dr. Adrian Israel is with us today on the call, and Gertrude Upperman, many of the folks that Gwen mentioned as well. So I want to thank you all for being here today. Miriam, thank you so much for opening us up. And if you all have any questions or comments, you're certainly welcome to join in at this point.
I have one observation, just one observation, that the context, of the neighborhood, the area where Guilford College is located, I think is very critical, because Raleigh's Crossroads, as you know, is the name of the church up on 40, and there were African-American graves that were paved over to complete I-40. And in fact, there was a significant presence from Guilford College all the way across I-40 back to Horsepen Creek Road of African-Americans who were freed during slavery and bought land after slavery. And so this kind of gentrification, the first thing that struck me when I came to the community was that there was an AME church across the street that you mentioned in, there was a picture of someone at an AME church. And that's a legacy, and it probably could be a good starting point for more research about this area, is that church and the people who attended it and who worked at Guilford College. And the reason there were so many, most of those housekeepers, I'm sure, and people who worked on the grounds and the buildings lived in this community. And I think that, because Doug Gilmer used to tell me, it was very poignant about how he felt crossing the street from his home to come on campus, and the students, you know, yelling on names at him as he walked by the dormitory. And he continued, you know, to serve them and persevere through that ordeal. He rarely talked about it, but I think one time he did. So I think that might be something to look into, the relationship between the college and this community over time around it. And what happened to those people whose land was bought up to build the luxurious houses that are now between the college and I-40. Just a thought. And thank you, this is marvelous.
Thank you for the foundation.
Couldn't have done it without you, Adrian.
Oh, well.
I'll echo that.
I couldn't have done anything without your help, so. And Gertrude's. I may add, and Gertrude, I see Gertrude's face there, and Gertrude Beal, because she did the first published article, I believe, she and Hiram Hilty on the Quakers and the Underground Railroad.
Thank you so much, Adrian. Anyone else who would like to comment or ask a question? Oh, yes, Gertrude. You're muted, dear. Oh. I think we may have lost her. Hopefully she'll jump back in. Oh, there she is. Okay. Just take off put your audio on, Ms. Upperman. Okay. And if there's anyone else while Gertrude is joining us, if there's anyone else who wants to, and if you go, Gertrude, right in the left-hand corner, you'll see, oh, you got it,
I got it.
Yes.
I just want to say to everyone, thank you so very much for the presentation. A lot of members of Persimmon Grove were mentioned as having worked on Guilford's campus. And there are a lot more from Collins Grove and from Raleigh's Crossroad that can be added to this list. So I'm going to work on it and give you the additional information. But I am just thrilled at the fact that you did recognize former members of Persimmon Grove, because Persimmon Grove has always had a great and glorious relationship with Guilford College. And I am very proud to be a Guilford graduate.
When the elders tell you that they approve, it's really special. Thank you so much.
Oh, I just had a comment. I'm actually a first year, and I'm in the history class with Sarah. And if it wasn't for her telling us that we had to go to one lecture outside of class, I wouldn't be here. But I'm so grateful that she did, because I just signed up knowing that it was required. But I I had a phenomenal time. It was really, really eye-opening and wonderful. And I think all of you did an excellent job. I just wanted to say that I learned so much. I thought that it was presented in a really clear and great way. And I just wanted to thank you for all the work that you all put into preserving all these legacies and people.
Thank you, Claire.
Thank you.
I would like to say thank you, Krishauna, Gwen, Sarah, and others who were involved. Dr. Israel, thank you for your work. I just want everyone to know that Krishauna and Gwen, I've watched them work on this project and our other project, USS Slavery Project, for over a year, and they have done outstanding work. I'm honored to work with you as colleagues, and this is absolutely amazing. And this is just a portion of the great work that they've done that was begun by Dr. Israel and others. So this is outstanding. Thank you for everyone who participated. I can't say enough how proud of you I am, and I am so happy to be a part of this work. And the information was just so inspiring and acknowledging of Black women and Black people who are really part of the history of this college and this community. So thank you so much. And I look forward to all the rest of the work that you all are doing. Thank you.
Thank you. I do see Jane Fernandez on the call. I do just want to honor the fact that she gave us the endorsement to start the USS work, which was a necessary step in terms of working with USS. They don't allow you to work with them without a college endorsement. And so we do thank you for that, Jane. I see you. And I'm not sure if Judy Harvey is on the call as well, but through the Friends Center, we did receive funding from her scholarship to be able to conduct a lot of the research that you're seeing as well. So I want to also honor Judith for those funds. Gwen or Sarah, we're about 4 minutes over. Do you have anything else before we close?
I'd just like to thank the trustees who are on this call. I know there's several Guilford College trustees who've joined us. And also, if anyone who hasn't noticed in chat, I did post, I posted the queries, but also we will be, this is recorded, so that will be something that will be available afterwards. And we make our slides and so forth available. Slavery.guilford.edu is our website where we'll be adding additional links at a later date.
And I would just also like to say thanks to everyone for coming. And as an oral historian, thanks in advance to any community partners, Ms. Upperman and others who would be willing to share their stories. Yes, thanks to all.
All right. Well, with this, we will continue to work on our marker project so that we can have that public history. And we're looking at that as a first step to our work. That will not be the conclusion of our work, but a first step, as Carrie and others and Reva has said, to continue to interrogate our history and our narrative. And so we thank you, and we will close out with a moment of silence. Thank you, friends.
Thank you.